And here we are at milepost 19. You see it says milepost, mile 19, Burke Gilman Trail. Along the Burke Gilman Trail, beautiful place, between Kenmore and Bothell, Washington. Now, you're probably wondering, why am I filming a milepost? Well, that's kind of an interesting question. Because you think that, well, what's the big deal about mileposts being along a hike and bike trail that was a converted railroad? See these long swoopy curves. It's a nice trail for bicycles because you don't have a lot of slopes, because that's the way railroads were built. And that's why they made railroads that were no longer in use into hike and bike trails. But I think it is a big deal. That milepost is fairly new. It's only been there in the last couple of years. I don't remember seeing him before. And I think it's an indication of something that we Americans did, and why I'm actually pretty optimistic as to how this whole thing will turn out here in 2021. Yeah, today is September 21st, 2021. So that's the date I'm filming this. Well, the reason is that back in 1975, I'm old enough to remember this, Congress passed something called the Metric Conversion Act, that we were going to change over to the metric system over a 10-year period. That obviously includes the road signs and everything like that. And in other English-speaking nations, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand specifically, during the 1970s, they changed their road signs over to kilometers. And the Irish Republic did so in the 1990s. And there's commentary on YouTube on how we Americans just didn't get with the program. But you're kind of wondering, well, how did that happen? How was it that the kilometer was so thoroughly rejected as a unit of road distance in the United States? And I says, well, it's very simple. We the people, Americans, from one end of the political spectrum to the other, simply said, no. That's it. That's what it took. Now, I know there are some saying, I'm not going to go over to the metric system. By golly, by gum, they're going to have to take my guns away from me to get me to go over the metric system or some damn thing, while holding his 9mm pistol. But, but the fact of the matter is, those weren't people who forced the decision. What forced the decision was the vast numbers of Americans saying no. I mean, there were things like some fuel stations, gasoline stations, changed their pumps over to liters. Having voluntarily converted to liters, their customers voluntarily converted to those stations that still sold by gallons. Pretty soon, they're back in gallons. And so on and so forth. Radio and television stations, they may be part of the mainstream media that are telling us that, by golly, this last election was up on the up and up, and everybody who says it wasn't is lying or believing a hoax or some other damn thing like that, and we're not even going to mention any evidence to the contrary. Yet they still do their weather reports in Fahrenheit, because they're competing with each other for audience. And when they started doing their weather reports in Celsius, people changed the channel. They want their weather reports in Fahrenheit. So that's pretty much how we Americans go. And it took a while, but there was no violence. There was no revolution. Pretty soon, the whole idea of changing our road signs to kilometers just disappeared. Whereas that mile 8 sign along State Route 522 didn't disappear, although it's been graffitied a bit. So that's the thing why I think it's pretty optimistic, and why some of us Americans call these units freedom units. Because you see, in our good friends in Australia, they let the country take away a big part of their language and a big part of their culture and change all their road signs to kilometers. And they said, oh, okay, we'll just do that. And supermarkets weigh their foods in kilograms and that stuff like that. We see the same thing in Canada, even though in Canada you go to the hardware stores, they sell paint in 3.78 liter cans, whereas we Americans, it's sold in 1 gallon cans. Now that's kind of the way things go when you're attached to the United States on a continent. But be that as it may, the simple thing is that we said no, and the government eventually accepted that decision. Whereas in Australia, not only did they just go along with it, when there was a mass shooting, the government says, okay, you gotta all turn in your guns. And they turned in their guns like a bunch of good little boys and good little girls. Everyone who didn't engage in a mass shooting turned in their guns. Well, that's interesting. Why should people who don't commit mass murder turn in their firearms? Because one guy did. That makes no sense. It just means that with the citizens disarmed, the one guy that wants to shoot him up doesn't have to worry about being killed by somebody with a concealed weapons license, like in Christchurch, New Zealand. In White Settlement, Texas, somebody tried to do the same thing at a church there, and his little massacre ended quickly with a death toll of 1 himself, because there were like 5 or 6 people who had concealed weapons licenses, all had their guns drawn and one fired, and that was the end of that. Had the Muslims in that mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand had similar concealed carry licenses and some training on firearm safety and whatnot, we wouldn't have heard about 50 people being killed in a mass shooting in New Zealand. It wouldn't have happened. But because the people in these countries are disarmed, and because they pretty much told the government, if the government says jump 1.6 meters, the government can expect them to jump 1.6 meters. So now we have the COVID pandemic, or scandemic, or plandemic, or whatever you want to call it, and they're engaged in crazy lockdown measures. Here in America, look, everybody's just driving their cars. People are walking on the trail. She doesn't have no mask on her face. People going about their business just like normal. Why is that? And why is it that the police are not enforcing any lockdown orders and never did here in the state of Washington? Well, I like to think they're a bunch of patriots who believe in the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution of the state of Washington. After all, they swore to uphold them to become officers. But I suspect it's also because they really don't want to take on the millions of Americans who own firearms. Many of them former military, many of them former police. And oh, by the way, the Taliban did spend the last 20 years teaching our United States Army how to do insurgency. And the graduates of their training seminars are all over the United States, and they own guns. So I guarantee you that our government's going to step a lot softer on us, at least here in the state of Washington, where a lot of people own guns, even if it both blue as a royal blue as the Federal Way high school color is, or maybe that's just a product of the mail-in ballots and the phony counting. Who knows? Maybe these elections are rigged. Why not? Elections in Arizona are turning out to be rigged. Elections in Georgia were definitely rigged. The other swing states were rigged. That's where we noticed it. But I wouldn't be a bit surprised that the Democrat Party dominance here in Western Washington is part of the rigging. That woke crap is not quite that popular. But we're dealing with it. People say, well, why aren't you engaged in the violent revolution if you have all those guns and you talk tough? It says, well, an actual violent revolution is pretty nasty business. You get a lot of property damage, a lot of people killed. We'd rather not do that if we can avoid it at all possible. But we think we can do things without violence when we need to do them. After all, you don't see that fuel being sold by leaders over there at that Shell station. No, sir. It ain't happening. To a certain extent, when we the people decide on something, and we're going to decide on cleaning up our elections, we're going to decide on our freedoms, the government's going to step a little softer than they do in places like Australia, New Zealand, and even Quebec in Canada. They have to. Because they know they can't stop us all. And that's why, hey, we're free to a certain extent. we're gonna get through this COVID crisis, realizing it's phony as a $3 bill as we realize it, and we're gonna put an end to this nonsense. If we don't do it violently, it's because, well, sometimes things take a little time. After all, it took about 10 years for our federal government and our state and local governments to get the idea we don't want kilometers on the roadsides. It took a while, but it happened. So that's my optimistic take on everything here, at the power of us Americans to do what we want, not what some globalist elite wants. Have a nice day, and we'll talk to you later.